Welcome to a conversation on the Western Alliance and East-West relations. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our distinguished guest today is the Right Honorable the Lord Carrington. Lord Carrington is Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. His distinguished career of public service spans 40 years and includes service as Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Minister of Overseas Development, and Secretary of State for Defense. Lord Carrington was chairman of the Lancaster House Conference at the end of 1979, which led to the solution of the Rhodesian problem and the formation of the independent Republic of Zimbabwe. From July to December 1981, he was president of the Council of Ministers of the European Community. Joining us in the studio is Professor Ernest Haas, the Robeson Professor of Government. Professor Haas is a leading authority on international relations and world politics. Lord Carrington, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
I thought I might begin by asking you what factors make for successful diplomacy?
Patience, consistency, knowledge, and if you want to be successful in the end, a great big slice of luck.
One of the problems that seem to confront diplomats is that they often have to look at the long term in the problems that they are dealing with. But in democracies, they have to work with and deal with politicians who have to worry about electorates and campaigns. And many of the problem in today's world seem to be relating these two problems. What is your assessment of the difficulties involved here?
Well, I think that the professional diplomat has a very much more difficult life nowadays than he used to have, partly because of the ease of communication and travel. And in the old days, I mean, the British ambassadors in the old days almost used to be able to declare war on their own, and nobody could stop them because probably communications took 3 or 4 weeks to get to them. Not sure that was a very good idea, but they had a great deal more independence than they have now. And I mean, if I can take one example of Western European diplomats, the British ambassadors in Rome, Paris, Bonn, and the French equivalents in the same capitals are really in a very difficult position vis-à-vis their European counterparts, because the European community has meant that the foreign ministers, the finance ministers, the the foreign and finance ministers are meeting all the time and see each other far more often than the ambassador would see the foreign minister. And to an extent, the role of a professional diplomat has changed. And what has happened is that the politician who is in charge of diplomacy has become that much more important, and the professional diplomats who are advising him in his capital are much more important. And in our systems, you have your system is so different from ours. I mean, we have a continuity in professional diplomacy. The minister changes, but the professionals go on advising. You don't have that thing. So there is, on the whole, more likely to be a continuity of policy in European countries than there may be here in the United States. All these problems are, to some extent, new, but we seem to get by.
But these shifts that come with public moods seem to, in some cases, blow situations all out of proportions. The 79 NATO deployment decision is a good example where a decision was made without anticipating the public outcry in some sectors about the decision. Whether that outcry was right or wrong is a separate question. And that, in a sense, seems to have created a whole other set of problems over and above the actual decision to deploy the weapons.
As a matter of fact, I wouldn't agree with the premise of that question. I mean, I think that the Twintrack decision, I was Foreign Minister at the time, I mean, I think the Twintrack decision was taken precisely to take care of public opinion. There were one or two European countries who were not particularly in favor of an immediate decision and deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles. And they wanted another effort to create some sort of more stable relationship between East and West in which you didn't have to deploy these weapons. And what the Twintrack decision did was to say, unless we get an agreement in 4 years' time, these missiles will be deployed. And I don't think, and of course this is hindsight, I mean, I don't think in hindsight we realized that the consequence of that decision would be to keep the deployment of the cruise and Trident missiles in front of the public opinion for 4 years. Really headline news for 4 years. And that in itself stirred up the opposition rather than the decision to deploy cruise and Trident itself. I mean, I don't believe that if, I'm not making a criticism, why should I? I was party to it. but if one did it again, I'm not at all sure that it wouldn't have been more sensible to say, right, we will deploy these missiles when they are done. I mean, for example, the opposition to INF in Europe has really diminished very considerably since the deployment. And I think that in itself is a lesson.
Could I come into
Sure,
this?
please.
I'd like to go back to what you said a moment ago about the qualities of the ideal diplomat, with emphasis on patience and knowledge, and link this to the situation you described, in which the ability of maneuver left to the diplomat is reduced by the fact that the head of government or the responsible minister is much more actively involved in actual negotiations nowadays than used to be the case generations ago. And this is particularly illustrated in the politics of the European community, as you said. Now, you were actively involved at one point in seeking to resolve at a lower level of activity, less than the head of government, the budgetary crisis that Mrs. Thatcher has been upset about for some years. And if I recall correctly, the formula you then attempted didn't fly. Eventually it was settled after a crisis which some people say is the worst crisis the community's had since the de Gaulle crisis of the 1960s. Where did the knowledge and the patience come in this situation? Why didn't Mrs. Thatcher play by those rules?
That's a very tendentious question, as a
It
matter of
is.
fact. Because
It is.
I mean, the fact was that the British were financing the whole of the rest of the community. We were paying the bills.
You were.
And since we are by no means the richest country in the community, no doubt our fault as much as anybody else's, it didn't seem a very equitable way of arranging the finances of the community. And I would have thought that there was something to be said for the British position on that.
I'm not arguing that.
Therefore, we had a difficulty over some years to convince our European neighbours that there was a problem. I mean, it took 2 years to convince them there was a problem, and then it took a great many more years to convince them that there should be an equitable solution. But the interesting thing about that, I mean, we were extremely patient. Very patient.
That's true.
Persistent too. And I said those were the two qualities of diplomacy. But you know, one of the interesting things about that dispute and that difficulty, and to some extent it soured relationships in the economic side of the community, it never had any effect upon the defence and foreign policy side of the community.
Quite.
And that, I think, was very interesting, that indeed, at that period of time when that quarrel was going on, there was a greater degree of political cooperation within the 10 countries of Europe than there had ever been before. And that, I think, shows a certain sophistication and a certain knowledge of priorities amongst European countries, which is rather refreshing.
So the moral of that story is, if I may extract a conclusion, and correct me if it's the wrong conclusion, is that one thing diplomats have learned to do and responsible ministers have learned to do is, so to speak, to separate issues, to separate contexts, and not to let disagreement on one dimension, this is among allies, not to let disagreement on one dimension spoil the game on some other dimension.
I think that's right, because I think that Western diplomats generally see that in terms of foreign affairs and defense, there is a greater need and a greater, the dangers of falling out are infinitely greater than they are in economic terms. I mean, the consequences for your domestic people, I mean, your own electorate may be difficult, but in global terms, I think Western Europe, and I think not just Western Europe, but the West generally, has learnt that there are things that are more important than these rather less global quarrels.
Let's look at the Falklands. Diplomacy failed there. What is your assessment?
Diplomacy wasn't given a chance. Diplomacy didn't fail. Sorry.
No. Okay. Well, that's fine. So that and it didn't give a chance because of the domestic situations at work in one of the actors. Yeah.
In a sense, in both countries. In the Argentine, it was perfectly clear that for domestic reasons and the domestic problems that General Galtieri had, and he had very considerable domestic problems, there was an opportunity to take people's eye off that particular problem and make them look at something else, and he thought at that moment that there was a good opportunity of getting away with it. And so in the middle of conversations, he decided to invade the Falklands. In my own country, I think the problem was that on the right of the political spectrum, there was a feeling that how can you really accommodate or talk about sovereignty when you have 2,000 people, whatever it is, of British descent living there. You've got to be very careful before you do anything. On the left of the political spectrum, there was a feeling, how could you conceivably talk to a dictatorship, a right-wing dictatorship with a human rights record of such appalling horror? How could you really talk to them in terms of coming to some accommodation? I personally have always thought that there was a solution possible. Maybe it would have taken a bit of time to reach it, but I do think that there was a solution possible in terms of leaseback. In terms of saying, I mean, as long as you've got a sufficiently long leaseback, you say, well, you the Argentines, can have the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands, but you lease them back to us, and we carry on just as we are now for 100 years or whatever it is. And I think in 100 years' time, the world is going to look a very different place. I think that was a possibility, but it was not sellable domestically in my country at that time. And I do not believe at that time that the Argentines would have accepted a long enough period of leaseback to have really made it possible. But diplomacy takes a very long time. All these things are going to take a long time. Most of all, arms negotiations are going to take a long time. And we mustn't look in the short term at all these things.
The leaseback formula was not acceptable in Britain even before the invasion.
No, because what I did when I was Foreign Secretary, I sent one of my ministers over there and to talk about leaseback with the Argentines, and I mean they were not wholly negative. There were obviously very great problems, and then we floated this to Parliament just before, about a year or so, well, 6 months, 9 months before the Falklands invasion, and this was derided by the House of Commons on both sides, both the Conservative and the Labour side.
On grounds that this
on the grounds that
the principle of national self-determination.
Well, on the Conservative side, that on the other side, a right-wing dictatorship with a bad human rights record. How can you deal with them? How can you trust them? You know.
What are there any long-term implications of the Falkland crisis in terms of what resulted, the use of force, and that its lessons for the international system? Does it make force a more likely outcome in such?
You can draw all sorts of conclusions from it, really, can't you? I mean, you can you can draw the conclusion that it doesn't pay, and that when you try something like that and you have a determined opponent, you lose.
That is the Argentine aggression. Yeah, right.
Yes. You could draw the conclusion that it's perhaps wise not to take the British totally for granted and write them off. That's another conclusion you might draw. Equally, you might draw the conclusion that in this very imperfect world, things like this are going to happen, and the enormous power of the superpowers is unable to prevent that happening. And I think one has seen that really ever since the Second World War, that in a way the enormous military capacity of the United States inhibits its capacity to prevent things like this happening. Though I suppose Grenada was in a rather different category.
Oh, there is no doubt that the number of small wars that really don't threaten world peace in any significant sense has gone up tremendously in the last 20 years. And it rarely concerns the superpowers. They couldn't do anything about it meaningfully if they wanted to, really. And in my judgment, there's not necessarily a need to do anything about it.
What sort of conclusions do you think domestic electorates draw? Looking at the British response in the Falklands, the American response to Grenada. I mean, leaders seem to be very popular in the wake of such actions. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, or does it mean really not very much?
Well, I think both those things showed that there is in both our countries a nationalism, a patriotism. And I think that's a good thing in one way. I think it shows that that both countries are determined not to be pushed around and are going to defend themselves if attacked. That's a good thing. And I think it's surprised. I mean, in my own country, I think some people on the left of the spectrum were rather surprised that happened, because the people who were the most patriotic and most outraged about the Argentine action were, well, not most, but as much as anyone else, were really the ordinary man in the street and the dock worker and all the people who don't like to be pushed around. I think that, in a sense, is encouraging. But it does bring one to the problem, as a matter of fact, of my present job, because you have an alliance in which 16 countries share the defense of the Western world, well, 15 in France, which is in a slightly different position. Because they share the defense of the world, the national responsibility is slightly obscured. If you are a Frenchman, because the French have left the military side of NATO, you know that the money that you are spending for defense is for the defense of France. It's a national responsibility. Now, most of the other countries, rather less in my own, but most of the other countries feel that defense expenditure is a contribution to an alliance which is inevitably and properly dominated by the United States. And therefore there is a less of a sense of responsibility about it than I think anybody would like there to be. And it makes defense expenditure and defense budgets more difficult to arrange than it does, for example, in France. Now, I don't think it's any chance that the French don't have the same problems as a lot of the other European countries have about their defense budget.
And this actually relates to an important problem that confronts us today, which is that the public attitudes, on the one hand, seem to express a greater concern about nuclear weapons, and this leads to an emphasis on conventional defense, which requires much greater expenditures than, in fact, people may want. So people want their cake and to eat it too, so to speak. How do you assess that dilemma?
Well, I think that I think that is the dilemma. And the interesting thing is that those who are most opposed to nuclear weapons and most frightened of them refuse to draw the conclusion that you have just drawn. They ignore it and they close their eyes to it. And the fact remains that, like it or not, nuclear defense is cheap as compared with conventional defense.
Particularly if it's paid for by someone else.
And particularly if it's paid for by somebody else. And this is all one of the reasons why in the West we have over the years relied more on nuclear defense. I mean, if you are going to match the Soviet Union in terms of conventional capability on the Central Front and elsewhere, the amount of money you would spend would be really absolutely enormous. And not just the money, but the consequences in human terms of keeping people under arms.
Sure.
And what would happen to the economies of Western Europe if you did that. And I don't think that this is sufficiently realized. I mean, which isn't to say that you can't do more. I mean, I'm sure you can do more. But I think to match it is not something that the economies, and it would be Western Europe that would have to do it, is that any of those economies really could contemplate. And I don't believe that those who feel so strongly about nuclear weapons have really thought logically through what they're saying.
And is there a failure of the political leaders or the statesmen to explain this to the public? Or is there, on the public side, really just self-deception about these issues?
Well, I can only talk for Europe, and probably most of my European friends say I couldn't talk for Europe. But I mean, I will.
We give you permission, yes.
Well, because Europe, you know, one talks about Europe, but it's 14 different countries. You know, it's impossible.
We won't badger you on that.
That's right. That's right.
I think what's happened in Europe really basically is this, that in 1979, you had the Twintrack decision. You then had the invasion of Afghanistan. You then had the pressure by the Soviet Union on Poland. And you had a situation there in which, for reasons which I think were perfectly right after Afghanistan, and you couldn't go on with the Soviet Union as if nothing had happened. I mean, you couldn't talk to them as if you were not outraged by what had happened. And therefore, to a very large extent, negotiations, arms talks and so on with the Soviet Union stopped. And I think that people in Western Europe saw what they believed to be a proliferation of nuclear weapons in Western Europe, and nobody really doing very much to try and stop it. And I think that this began to alarm people. I mean, one of the things that I noticed very much in my own country is that 25 years ago, the campaign for nuclear disarmament consisted to a very large extent of the very left wing. And they marched from Aldermaston to London, and they were demonstrably, and looked, as a matter of fact, very, very left-wing. Now you people who march in those sorts of things are not those sort of people. I mean, some of them are, and some of them are fellow travellers of the Soviet Union, and some of them are bad people, but a very large number of them are perfectly ordinary people, some of whom would vote for my party, for the Conservative Party, who are genuinely worried about what is happening in the West and in the world generally.
That's true here as well.
And this, I think, is caused by, I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but I mean, I think that it's been caused by the sort of problems that I have been talking about. And as a result of that, the North Atlantic Alliance in Europe has too much come to be regarded as a military alliance, which is continually improving its deterrent capacity. When the people who founded NATO, and the Almel report, which after all is the Bible of NATO, really said that it was based on two pillars. I mean, there was the military deterrent, but there was the political side of it, and that the political side of it was just as important as the military side, which was to try to create a more stable relationship between East and West, and so help us all to live in a less foolish world than we do at the present time. Now that, I think, because of what has happened over the last 5 years, has to some extent been ignored, and I think it's very important that we should concentrate on that in the next few years. If we don't, and if we don't get that message home, if we don't make people understand what NATO is about, that it's a peace alliance, not a war alliance, then I think we shall find that support for it is eroded in Europe at any rate.
This raises the question, are the partners to the alliance still in agreement about the nature of the threat? I think there is agreement that the threat is the Soviet Union, but there seems to be less agreement, especially on the two sides of the Atlantic, about the nature of the threat and what is required in response to that threat.
I don't think that it's different. I don't think that that is probably true of governments. I think the difficulty we're having in European NATO is, in a way, the penalty of success. That for 35 years, the organization, and for 40 years, there hasn't been a war in Europe. I mean, for 35 years, I think the organization has prevented a Third World War and a war in Europe. And a generation has grown up which doesn't really remember the causes of the Second World War, or what it was like to fight a conventional war, or seen the devastation of Europe after the conventional war. And because this has been so successful, I think people are beginning to wonder whether there really is a threat. I mean, younger people, whether, how could the Soviet Union actually come across the Central? I mean, it's inconceivable they would. I mean, that sort of attitude. And I think that what we have got to try and put over to people in Europe, the younger people in Europe, is to ask them one very simple question, really, and there's this. You know that the defense expenditure of the Soviet Union is enormous. It's far greater than ours. That they are increasing it every year in offensive capability as well as defensive capability. What's it for? Now, there may be a whole lot of perfectly good reasons why they're doing it, or reasons which one can explain. Maybe they're frightened of us. I mean, I find that. Maybe they're frightened of being surrounded, rather a big circle. Maybe military bureaucracy has taken over, that once you start building up, you can't stop because military bureaucracy has taken over. I don't know. There may be reasons for it. But until such time as I see some diminution in the size of the Soviet threat, it seems to me fairly wise and prudent to keep the organization that we now have, which has kept the peace of the world for 35 years. And that seems to me so prudent and so sensible that we ought to be able to get that over to the people who query the need for our organization.
Would you say a little more about the theme you started to talk about, namely the political side of NATO, and speculate a little bit about options, possibilities that are open to us in the next 4 or 5 years along that line?
Well, I think there are three things that we ought to be doing, and I think are doing, one of them not as much as I would personally like to see. I think arms control talks, not just arms control, but arms reduction talks. If we continue, and really this is basically United States versus the Soviet Union.
Yes.
I mean, the Europeans must be consulted and informed and asked their opinion, but in the end it is bound to be a United States-Soviet negotiation.
We won't quote you on that.
No, you can quote me. You certainly quote me, because I think Europeans understand that perfectly well. As long as they're consulted, it must be the two of you do it. As long as you go on saying that you are prepared to talk to the Soviet Union without conditions about anything, I do not believe that in the end the Soviet Union can refuse, because it is inconceivable to think that their position in the rest of the world, they mind a bit about what the Third World talks about them, and they have a little bit of trouble with their own Eastern European allies. It's inconceivable that they go on refusing to talk. Don't let's assume because they talk that it's going to be easy. And we need all that patience and persistence and consistency and all the things that I was talking about. But I'm sure that there will be talks at some time or other. The second thing that we can do is to try and persuade the Soviet Union in the Stockholm talks and in the continuation of the CDE talks that it is sensible to try and defuse the situation in the sort of way that we have made suggestions about. And I think the third thing that we ought to do is to have very many more contacts with the Soviet Union than we do at the present time on the political level. Sometimes, I made a speech about 2 or 3 years ago which was widely reported about megaphone diplomacy, in which I afterwards greatly criticized on the grounds that I was for soft options. But I'm not for soft options at all. I'm very much in favor of the military side of NATO. I think I think it'd be crazy for us not to have a deterrent which deters war. It's madness. But what I do think is that the West generally is in such a strong position. I mean, we're militarily powerful, we're ideologically powerful. I mean, how would you feel if you were a Soviet leader after what's been happening in Poland?
Yes.
And we are economically powerful. What have we got to be frightened about in talking to the Soviet Union? And the more we talk to them, the more we discuss things with them, the more we get to know them, and the more they get to know us, the more likely it is that over the years some kind of modus vivendi will operate.
But this would presume, I suspect, something that is very difficult to accept for American governments and perhaps some groups in Europe, which is when an opportunity arises for pointing the finger at the failure of some Soviet policy, as in the case of Poland, for example. Then the temptation is to interrupt whatever talks there may be going on, or if not interrupt them, give the Soviets an excuse for
It's
interrupting them.
inevitable.
Well, should we refrain from making, for instance, pro-solidarity gestures in the Polish case? Should we refrain from having individual or collective economic embargoes in order to punish Jaruzelski for not dealing with solidarity in the way we would like to see it treated? Is this really not...
Yeah. But that's a slightly different point. I mean, I don't think that you should, and we'll come back to it, I don't think that you should not tell the Soviet Union when you think that they are doing the wrong thing and are behaving disgracefully. And I don't think that you continue as if nothing had happened. I think you make it perfectly plain in your conversations with the Soviet Union that provided they don't do another Afghanistan, provided that they don't do another Poland, and provided that they continue on the basis of looking after their own affairs and not trying to interfere in others, there is business to be done between the two blocs. But I don't think that you can ignore, merely because you want to talk to them, the sort of Afghanistan invasion. I think that would be quite wrong and sending the wrong signal to the Soviet Union. I think that there is a greater degree of difference of opinion between Europe and the United States about what you do to deal with the country concerned, like Poland, which isn't the Soviet Union. I mean, I think that that poses much more difficult problems. I have always, I mean, I'm rather ambivalent about it, to be truthful. I don't quite know what the answer is. I don't think you can do nothing, but I think if you do too much, you actually, it's counterproductive.
That's my fear as well.
And you push the Poles more into the arms of the Russians. And I think that this is now beginning to be realized, and one's seen the Poland joining the IMF and that sort of thing. One's seen that that has been, to some extent, accepted. But I understand the American position on this, but I'm not sure I share all of it.
Is part of the problem in the megaphone diplomacy comes in because we are democracies and the political leaders are also talking to their own electorates, and that on the negative side, when something bad happens, we have to overstate its badness for political reasons. In other words, that this is a very fine line that has to be walked between being firm and resolute in denouncing something as opposed to pandering to domestic electorates. On the other side of the equation, when something is right, something goes right in relations between East and West, a successful arms control negotiation is reached, it's oversold to the public. And it makes it is made to appear that all the problems have been solved, that there's no longer competition or a conflict of interest.
I think that is a problem, but you see, I mean, it goes on to another problem, really, which is that the East, I mean, the Soviet Union's foreign policy is wholly consistent and has been for the last, well, we've had Gromyko for 27 years. it's been totally consistent and it's really never changed very much. Our foreign policies in the West have changed really quite a lot. I mean, not just with presidents, but with different governments in Europe, because different governments in Europe can send signals to the Soviet Union which can do as much to upset Western foreign policy as the United States can. And it's very difficult to see in an alliance of 16 nations, all of them with different governments of different political complexion. I mean, ranging from Mr. Papandreou to Mrs. Thatcher, to see that they're all going to view everything alike. But I don't believe that we are really going to be able to have a consistent policy vis-à-vis the Soviet Union unless all the 16 countries realize that there's got to be an element of agreement which they stick to in our attitude towards the Soviet Union. Because, I mean, if you take, for example, the opposition in my own country at the moment, which has, broadly speaking, gone unilateral. Well, you're sending a signal to the Soviet Union. They say, well, one day, perhaps, the Labour Party in Britain will be the government. Britain is a nuclear power. If they got into power, they're going to get rid of these things anyway. Why do we have to start negotiating about this? It'll fall like a ripe plum into our hands. And so one of the sad things of the last few years has been the increasing lack of bipartisan foreign and defence policy in the West generally. I mean, it's happened a bit here, I mean, tiny bit here compared to what it has in Europe, but it's happened to a very large degree in Europe. And that, I think, is very worrying, and I think we've got to do what we can to put that right.
Before, when we were talking about the '79 decision, and you expressed the view that there was concern about the public image of what was being done, part of the problem there was the unevenness of development in the different partners to the alliance. What I have in mind here is that the commitment to the dual track, in a sense, was became more precarious in this country when a new administration came in that really was ambivalent about arms control. So that
to put it charitably.
Right. Well, yes. So the problem when you're dealing with something like the alliance is that these management problems of consensus among the partners are extraordinarily difficult, because the Europeans were clearly ready to go with the deployment, with the simultaneous commitment to arms control which might prevent the deployment. And one has to believe that part of the cause of events in Europe was the change in policies in the United States with a new administration, which has to do with our whole electoral cycle of every 4 years possibly reconsidering all our policies.
Well, I mean, without actually making a judgment about the reasons why you say it happened. I mean, I think that the fact is that there is this problem with the 4-year cycle, and there's the problem not just of the 4-year cycle, but the fact that at the end of the 4-year cycle, if you change presidents, you change almost everybody else.
That's right.
And it takes a very long time, or months anyway, for the people concerned to get to know their jobs, and the Western world stops for about 6 or 9 months. And all right, that's a disadvantage, and we have our problems with it, but I don't think any of us in any of our countries would have it otherwise. I think we occasionally want to change our governments, particularly if the one we dislike happens to be in power.
Maybe even once a year. Right? That's right. That's right. One of the responses in Europe to all of this is the gradual movement toward raising the question of, I will state this very diplomatically, of a greater European identity within the alliance. The talks between the French and the Germans, the meetings for reconvening the Western European Union, and so on. What is your view of those developments? Are they positive? Under what circumstances might they go too far?
Well, I think they're positive for the reasons we were talking about earlier, about the sort of European identity, make people feel that they're more responsible for their own defense. And I don't think anybody, either American or European, who's interested in the alliance would quarrel with the objective. My problem is I'm not at all sure how you're going to reach the objective without being in danger of decoupling the alliance, without danger of either making the Americans feel they're no longer wanted in Europe or needed in Europe, or that there is an inner club which is taking decisions and then coming to tell them about it. I mean, all these things would be extremely dangerous and much worse than leaving things as they are. But I do think that if you could get a greater discussion in Europe of defense and security, that would be a very considerable plus. You see, the European community can't do it because of Ireland, and Ireland being neutral, and they're not prepared to do it. I mean, it is a fairly odd situation, instead, if you look at it logically, that there are these countries whose economies are now so closely tied together that they are, you know, it's like even more indissoluble than marriage. I mean, you know, we're stuck with each other, and yet we don't talk about defense or security. I mean, it's a very odd and illogical situation, but there it is. And so what other forum is there? And I suppose WEU is one, but WEU only consists of 7 countries. You're excluding 7 other European countries from it, so you've got to be very careful about that. And France, in any event, is not part of the military structure of NATO, so there are some enormous problems. But even talking about it and actually discussing the problem is in itself a good idea, but not to the point where you have a club within a club, or even a European club within Europe, or being in danger of alienating the United States, because without the United States, the alliance isn't credible.
Is it a tenable proposition that because France does not participate in the military part of NATO, is not part of the integrated command, but since presumably on France's table of contingencies of a war, the French forces would fight in Germany, therefore any bilateral or more limited Franco-German military understanding is really an indirect route for reintegrating France into the military structure?
I don't think that there are any circumstances which any French president of any political party could reintegrate France into the military structure. I don't think it could be done. I think probably President Mitterrand has been more cooperative and more forthcoming to the alliance than any of his other predecessors. And I think on the whole things are not going too badly. So I do agree with you. I mean, I think that Franco-German cooperation is an admirable thing, and I think the more there is of it, the better. But I don't think that when you know, Helmut Schmidt had some ideas recently about Franco, the French were going to give the nuclear deterrent as a protection to the Germans, and the Germans were going to re-equip the French army in conventional weapons, and they were going to be the bulwark in the central front. I mean, I don't think that sort of thing is a starter, because it really ignores the rest of NATO.
Yes.
But I think greater collaboration is greatly to be encouraged.
Let's talk a little more about the relationship of the Europeans to the Americans. We have had most recently the introduction of the Nunn Amendment, which differs in one important respect, in the sense that Nunn doesn't really come out of an isolationist tradition in the way that...
He's not a Mansfield.
Right, right. And in fact, he's a senator deeply concerned about military appropriations, the importance of them, and about the alliance. And what he seems to have been doing is creating an incentive structure for our alliance partners to meet the standards that have been set for their contribution, namely the 3%. Would you give us your assessment of the Nunn Amendment?
Well, he's doing 2.5 things, really. I mean, he is saying that there are certain areas in the alliance which ought to be improved, and he singles out 2 of them. First of all, the airfields, which would be necessary to be equipped and hardened for the reinforcement of United States aircraft coming to Europe, which has fallen behind the program. Now, that seems to me to be not only logical but good sense and ought to be done. And I believe that with the new, I'm sorry about the jargon, but with the new infrastructure program, which is, I hope, going to be agreed in the not too distant future, I think we should be able to do something on those lines. Secondly, what he's saying is, what is the point of the United States being able to have fight a conventional war for 60 days? That the jargon for that is sustainability. If the sustainability of some of the European countries is 15 days or whatever it is, that seems to me to be very good sense as well. And therefore, I think we must do something about that, and I think that can be done. I mean, it's merely a question of making it a greater priority. He is then going on to say, really, that unless all these things are done, the United States ought to decide to withdraw, whatever it is, 100,000 troops from Europe. Now, and we'll come back to the 3% in a minute, but I find that a very illogical thing for Senator Nunn to say, because if in effect he is saying the danger is so great that you have to pull your socks up and you've got to do more, why then is it not so great for the United States, whose whole attitude towards Europe has been that the defense of Europe is part of the defense of the United States? Why then would you actually withdraw troops? And the consequence, incidentally, of withdrawing troops, psychologically, from Europe, would be much greater, I think, than anybody here realizes. Those troops are a symbol of the adherence of the United States to the alliance and their seriousness about what they mean to do in the event of trouble. And then the other problem about Senator Nunn's sanctions are that it is really very difficult for one country to give, in effect, an ultimatum to 15 sovereign countries, or 14, whatever it is. And it will be very badly received. I mean, it really would be very badly received, and wouldn't, I think, have the consequences which Senator Nunn hopes would follow. What is interesting is that the consequences which Senator Nunn hopes would follow have to some very large extent followed already. And people have decided that they've got to do things to remedy the deficiencies which he's seen. So that's very encouraging. On the 3%, well, I don't think that any country can do 3% in real terms on their defense budget in perpetuity. I just don't think it's possible, because you would you get the whole balance of these budgets so out of proportion. My own country, we've been doing 3% for quite some time. I don't think you can go on doing it. I mean, you would get a situation in which it would be politically impossible to carry on. You also have the problem in Europe that the economies of Europe have not recovered, some of them not recovered at all, but anyway, nothing like the same degree as the United States economy had. And some of them have got austerity programs in which they're cutting social services and reducing public expenditure. Very difficult for them to say, all right, I'll cut social services and public expenditure, but increase defense expenditure. So we really do have some difficult problems there. And, I mean, some countries will do more and some will find it more difficult. But I don't think that anybody in Europe is under any illusion about the need for strengthening conventional capability, and we shall manage somehow, though no doubt we shall be as disappointing to some Americans as we've always been, who never will look at the figures and see how much we are doing in that fact.
Which you know, raises the other issue here, that in a sense the Nunn Amendment is a response to the question of burden sharing and the rightly or wrong perception of the American people that we're being had, whether it's by the world, by the developing countries, or in this particular case by our alliance partners, that they're not paying their fair share for the alliance. What is your response to that mood in America?
I'm glad you give me the opportunity. It depends what figures you... I mean, figures can prove... I mean, you two know that better than anybody else. Figures can prove anything. If you take the figures from 1980 to 1984, there's no doubt the United States, I mean, since the Reagan administration, the United States has spent very much more on defense than Europe has. If you take the figures from 1970 to 1984, Europe has done comparably a very great deal more than the United States. And so, 90% of the troops facing the Soviet Union in Europe are European, and 80% of the air forces and tanks and so on. I mean, it isn't a wholly discreditable performance on the part of the Europeans. And of course, one always talks about what you put into defence. It might be more sensible to talk about what you get out of it. I mean, for example, the Germans have conscription. You don't. So the Germans pay their soldiers, their servicemen, very much less than you pay yours. Consequently, they can afford to spend a greater proportion of their defence budget on sharp things, on weapons. We provide, I mean, one says it in a flippant way, but it is not really a flippant subject. We provide the battlefield, and we provide all the exercise grounds. We provide 101 things which are not quantifiable in terms of defence budgets. So I don't think that really this is sufficiently understood in this country. What I've said isn't going to make any difference. I'm very well aware of that. These arguments have been put to congressmen, and they've said, oh yes, and then gone on to say the Europeans must do more. Well, we have got to do more. I'm not saying we haven't got to do more, but I think it is a great pity, both in terms of the alliance and East-West relations, to decry the effort that Europe has made and the state of our conventional forces at the present time.
Another issue here, we shall touch all the bases and give you another opportunity to respond, is that when you talk about a conventional defense, you raise the issue of what is called the two-way street, which is how much of these increased expenditures for conventional defense will be for equipment bought and weapons bought in the United States or in Europe, and the clear advantage that the United States has in the sort of the ET technologies, the so-called emerging technologies in conventional weaponry that may make the difference. This is also an important problem confronting NATO, which to some extent Americans are going to have to be educated about. Is that correct?
Well, the proportion are that Europe buys 7 times as much from you in terms of defence equipment as you buy from us. And of course that is an enormous burden on the European economies because, particularly with a high dollar, I mean, in this last year, those who bought F-16s have seen the price of F-16s go up by 20% because of the strength of the dollar, and that in a small country with a small budget is a hell of a lot of money. So there is a problem there. I think it's partly the Europeans' fault. I mean, I think it's more the Europeans' fault than it is your fault, because when you talk about a two-way street, you've got a street, we've got 7 alleys, and we're all competing against each other. I mean, the French against the British against the Germans, the French against the Italians, and so on. And therefore, I think that we've got to get our act together. I don't think I would agree with you about ET. I think that if we got our act together, don't underestimate the technology there is in Europe, and I think we're quite capable of doing these things. I think what we haven't done is so to arrange our affairs that we get together. And it's our fault more than yours.
One final question, Lord Carrington. If there was one misconception about the alliance that you would like to correct, if you had an opportunity to remedy that misperception, what is it? I mean, is there something that we Americans are not seeing about the alliance, its important, the contribution of the Europeans, or so on?
No, I don't actually think that my wish would be really directed at America. I think my wish would be directed at particularly Europe, and in some degree, I suppose, to some people in the United States, not to think of NATO as just a military alliance, but as an alliance of like-minded people who are trying to preserve the peace by military deterrence, but equally by political means. And I think that the political side of it is very, very important.
And what in particular would the political side look like down the road? The kinds of things that we should do that we're not doing?
Negotiations we're talking about. I mean, the talks, the arms control, the arms reductions, the CDE, the Stockholm talks, Geneva, all the rest of it, and it would look and must look as if we are trying to get some kind of more stable relationship between East and West. If we don't, we shall find it much more difficult to keep the support of the alliance in all our countries.
Lord Carrington, thank you very much for joining us today. Professor Haas, thank you. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation on Western defense and East-West relations.
That's
Very
it?
good. Yeah, I think
That should bore them to
What I really wanted to ask you,
Yeah.
I couldn't ask you.
Yeah, we will. Yeah, we'll remain. Can we talk? We can talk, yeah.
What I really wanted to ask you, but couldn't obviously. If we said to Papandreou, go to hell.
He wouldn't want to.
uh,
I mean, he'd be much worse out of NATO than
and you transfer the facilities. I mean, their position in NATO now is the same as the French, essentially. They're not part of the integrated command. Okay, we shift all this stuff to Turkey.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it would be